If you think you know what it means to find hidden treasures, wait until you hear about Marcus Thompson's incredible discovery. Today, I'm going to tell you the most amazing story of faith, perseverance, and an unexpected revelation that will leave you speechless. Marcus Thompson, a war veteran ridiculed by his entire community for buying an abandoned church, never imagined that his loyal dog would uncover secrets buried beneath the altar that would change everything. If you want to know how this extraordinary story unfolds, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our incredible stories. Now let's dive into this remarkable tale that proves sometimes the greatest discoveries come from the most unexpected places. The autumn wind whistled through the broken windows of St. Mary's Episcopal Church as Marcus Thompson stood on the cracked sidewalk, keys heavy in his weathered palm. The October sky hung low and grey over Cedar Falls, Iowa, matching the skeptical expressions of the townspeople who had gathered to witness what they called the biggest mistake in the county's history. At 62, Marcus had seen enough doubt in his lifetime to fill a cemetery, but the whispers still stung like winter air against his scarred cheek. "That fool veteran's lost his mind," muttered Harold Peterson, the hardware store owner, loud enough for Marcus to hear. $35,000 for that rotting pile of wood and stone. Should have bought himself a nice trailer instead. Marcus's German shepherd Duke pressed against his master's leg, sensing the tension that radiated from the crowd like heat from summer asphalt. The dog's intelligent brown eyes scanned the faces of the onlookers, reading the same disapproval that had followed Marcus since he'd returned from Afghanistan 15 years ago. Duke had been with Marcus for 8 of those years, a rescue dog who understood trauma in ways that most humans never could. "Don't listen to them, boy," Marcus whispered, his fingers finding the familiar comfort of Duke's thick fur. The dog's presence was the only constant in a life that had been shattered and rebuilt more times than Marcus cared to count. "We know what we're doing." But did they? Marcus's weathered hands trembled slightly as he inserted the old brass key into the church's heavy oak door. The lock turned with a groan that seemed to echo through the hollow bones of the building, and the door swung open to reveal shadows that had been undisturbed for nearly a decade. The musty smell of abandonment rushed out to greet them, a mixture of rotting wood, dust, and something else Marcus couldn't quite identify. Something that made Duke's ears perk up and his nose twitch with interest. Sarah Mitchell, the local real estate agent who had reluctantly handled the sale, stepped forward with a clipboard clutched against her chest like armor. At 38, she had lived in Cedar Falls her entire life and had never seen the community so united in their disapproval of a single decision. "Mr. Thompson, I have to ask one more time, are you absolutely certain about this purchase? The inspection report showed significant structural damage, and the heating system hasn't worked since 2010. Marcus turned to face the assembled crowd, his blue eyes steady despite the uncertainty that gnawed at his stomach. The Purple Heart medal he wore on a chain beneath his flannel shirt felt heavier than usual, a reminder of the courage he'd once shown in places far more dangerous than a small Iowa town. "I've made my decision, Ms. Mitchell. Sometimes a man has to follow his instincts, even when the whole world thinks he's crazy." The crowd began to disperse as the first drops of rain started to fall, their disappointed murmurs following them down the tree-lined street. Marcus watched them go, feeling the familiar isolation that had been his companion since returning from the war. In Afghanistan, he'd led a squad of 12 brave soldiers through some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth. Here in Cedar Falls, he couldn't even buy a building without becoming the town's favorite topic of gossip. Duke whined softly and pawed at the church's threshold, his behavior unusually agitated. The dog had always been sensitive to his surroundings, a trait that had saved Marcus's life more than once during their walks through the Iowa countryside. But this was different. Duke's nose was working overtime, and his tail, usually a barometer of his mood, hung low and uncertain. "What is it, boy?" Marcus asked, kneeling down to meet the dog's gaze. Duke's eyes were fixed on something beyond the open doorway, something in the depths of the church that Marcus couldn't see. "You smell something in there?" The church's interior stretched out before them like a cavern carved from shadows and memory. Dust motes danced in the weak afternoon light that filtered through stained glass windows depicting scenes from the Bible, their colors muted by years of neglect. The wooden pews, once polished to a warm honey glow, now bore the grey patina of abandonment. Some had been moved or overturned, creating an obstacle course that spoke of the building's final chaotic days as an active place of worship. Marcus stepped inside, his boots echoing against the warped hardwood floors. The sound seemed to travel forever in the cavernous space, bouncing off the vaulted ceiling and returning as a whispered reminder of all the prayers that had once filled this sacred space. Duke followed reluctantly, his claws clicking nervously against the wood as he stayed close to Marcus's side. The altar dominated the far end of the church, a massive structure carved from dark oak that had somehow survived the years better than anything else in the building. Behind it, a large wooden cross hung slightly askew, its surface bearing the scars of time and weather from a leak in the roof that had long since been patched with mismatched shingles. But it was the area around the altar that seemed to capture Duke's attention most intensely. "This place has good bones," Marcus said aloud, his voice carrying a confidence he didn't entirely feel. He'd spent the last of his savings on this purchase, driven by something he couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the way the morning sun had streamed through those stained glass windows when he'd first toured the property. Maybe it was the sense of peace he'd felt standing where hundreds of people had once gathered to find solace and community. Or maybe it was simply the desperate need to belong somewhere, to have a project that could give meaning to days that had felt increasingly empty since his retirement from the factory. Sarah Mitchell had followed them inside, her heels clicking impatiently against the floor. "Mr. Thompson, I hope you understand that the sale is final. The City Council was very clear about that, and given the condition of this building, I'm afraid you won't find it easy to resell if you change your mind." "I won't be changing my mind," Marcus replied, running his hand along the smooth surface of a pew. Despite the dust and neglect, he could feel the craftsmanship in the wood, the care that had gone into every joint and curve. This church was built to last. It just needs someone who believes in second chances. Duke had wandered ahead, his nose still working furiously as he investigated the area around the altar. Suddenly, he stopped and began pawing at a specific spot on the floor, his behavior becoming more urgent. He whined and looked back at Marcus, then returned to pawing at the same location with increasing intensity. "What's gotten into him?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with annoyance. "Dogs shouldn't be running around in here anyway. This is still a consecrated building, technically speaking." Marcus approached Duke, kneeling down to examine the spot that had captured the dog's attention. At first glance, it looked like any other section of the worn hardwood floor. But as Marcus looked more closely, he could see subtle differences in the wood grain, as if this particular area had been replaced or repaired at some point. The boards didn't quite match the rest of the floor, and there were tiny gaps between them that suggested they might not be as firmly secured as they appeared. "Easy, boy," Marcus said, gently pulling Duke back from his frantic investigation. "We'll figure out what's got you so worked up, but let's get Ms. Mitchell out of here first." Sarah was already gathering her papers and preparing to leave, her discomfort with the entire situation evident in every gesture. "I'll need you to sign these final documents, Mr. Thompson. After that, the property is entirely your responsibility. The city wants it made clear that they won't be providing any assistance with repairs or code violations." Marcus signed the papers without reading them, his attention still focused on Duke's unusual behavior. The dog had moved away from the altar, but continued to cast anxious glances in that direction, as if he could sense something that remained hidden from human perception. It was the same behavior Duke had exhibited in Afghanistan when he detected buried explosives or hidden threats, a sixth sense that had saved countless lives during their deployment. As Sarah's car disappeared down the tree-lined street, Marcus found himself alone with Duke in the vast, empty church. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft patter of rain against the stained-glass windows and the occasional creak of old wood settling into new positions. It was a peaceful silence, the kind that invited contemplation and prayer, but it was also heavy with the weight of years and secrets. "Well, boy, it's just you and me now," Marcus said, settling onto one of the more stable pews. Duke immediately came to sit beside him, leaning his warm body against Marcus's leg in a gesture of comfort and solidarity. "Think we bit off more than we can chew?" The question hung in the air unanswered, but Marcus felt a strange sense of rightness about being in this place. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The townspeople might think he was crazy, and his bank account might disagree with his decision, but something deep in his gut told him that buying St. Mary's had been the right choice. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus began a more thorough exploration of his new property. The church was larger than it had appeared from outside, with several small rooms branching off from the main sanctuary. There was an old office that had once belonged to the pastor, its walls lined with empty bookshelves and filing cabinets that had been cleaned out years ago. A small kitchen occupied the space behind the altar, its ancient appliances and chipped countertops telling the story of countless church dinners and community gatherings. But it was the basement that truly captured Marcus's imagination. Accessed through a narrow wooden staircase hidden behind a door near the pulpit, the basement was a time capsule of the church's history. Old hymnals were stacked in corners alongside Christmas decorations from decades past. Folding chairs and tables were arranged in neat rows, waiting for events that would never come. And everywhere there were photographs, dozens of them documenting baptisms, weddings, confirmations, and community celebrations that stretch back to the church's founding in 1923. Duke followed Marcus down into the basement, but his agitation seemed to increase with every step. The dog's ears were constantly moving, swiveling toward sounds that Marcus couldn't hear, and his nose never stopped working. Whatever had caught Duke's attention upstairs seemed to be even stronger down here in the church's foundation. "You're really spooked, aren't you, boy?" Marcus observed, scratching behind the dog's ears in an attempt to calm him. "What do you think is down here that's got you so worked up?" As if in answer to Marcus's question, Duke suddenly bolted across the basement toward a corner where several pieces of old furniture had been stored. He began pawing at the floor again, this time with even more urgency than he'd shown upstairs. Marcus followed, using the flashlight on his phone to illuminate the dim corner. What he found made his breath catch in his throat. Hidden behind a stack of old chairs and a dusty piano, there was a small section of the basement floor where the concrete had been broken and then hastily repaired. The repair job was old, probably decades old, but it was clearly visible once you knew what to look for. Someone had taken great care to hide this spot, covering it with furniture and hoping it would never be discovered. Duke was pawing at the edge of the repaired concrete, his whines becoming increasingly desperate. It was as if he could sense something beneath the surface, something that his sensitive nose and acute hearing could detect, but that remained invisible to human senses. Marcus knelt beside the dog, running his fingers over the rough surface of the concrete patch. "What do you think, Duke?" Marcus whispered, his mind racing with possibilities. "Think there's something down there worth finding?" The dog's response was immediate and unmistakable. He looked directly into Marcus's eyes and barked once, sharply, then returned to pawing at the concrete. It was the same signal Duke had used in Afghanistan to indicate the presence of hidden dangers or important discoveries. In the war zone, that bark had meant the difference between life and death. Here in the basement of an abandoned church, it might mean something entirely different, but Marcus had learned to trust his dog's instincts implicitly. As the sun began to set outside, painting the basement in deeper shadows, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, he would rent a jackhammer and find out what secrets lay buried beneath the floor of St. Mary's Episcopal Church. He had no idea what he might find, but Duke's behavior convinced him that whatever was down there was significant enough to warrant investigation. The drive home to his small apartment above the diner was quiet, with Duke uncharacteristically subdued in the passenger seat. The dog kept turning to look back in the direction of the church, as if he could still sense whatever had captured his attention, even from a distance. Marcus had seen Duke behave this way only a few times before, and each time it had led to discoveries that had profound implications for their mission in Afghanistan. That night, Marcus lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his modest bedroom, his mind churning with questions and possibilities. What could be buried beneath the floor of a small-town church? The rational part of his mind suggested mundane explanations. Old plumbing, a forgotten time capsule, maybe even a former pastor's buried belongings. But the veteran in him, the man who had learned to read danger and opportunity in the subtlest of signs, suspected that whatever Duke had detected was far more significant than anything so ordinary. Duke spent the night pacing restlessly around the apartment, occasionally whining softly and looking toward the window that faced in the direction of St. Mary's. The dog's behavior was so unusual that Marcus began to wonder if he had made a mistake in leaving the church. Maybe Duke had sensed some kind of immediate threat, something that required their presence to prevent disaster. But as the hours passed and no emergency sirens pierced the quiet Iowa night, Marcus convinced himself that whatever secrets lay beneath the church floor could wait until morning. The next day dawned grey and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into your bones and stay there. Marcus arrived at the church early, bringing coffee and a box of donuts that he shared with Duke, while they sat in the cab of his pickup truck, gathering courage for what lay ahead. The rental company had promised to deliver a small jackhammer by 9 o'clock, along with the safety equipment and protective gear that Marcus would need for the excavation. Word of Marcus's planned dig had somehow reached the ears of Cedar Falls's most dedicated gossips, and by the time the equipment arrived, a small crowd had gathered outside the church. Harold Peterson was there, of course, along with Martha Stevenson from the post office and half a dozen other townspeople who had nothing better to do on a Thursday morning than watch their resident eccentric make an even bigger fool of himself. $20 says he hits a water pipe and floods the whole place, Harold announced loudly, pulling out a crumpled bill and waving it in the air. Any takers? Martha Stevenson, a woman whose knowledge of local affairs was legendary, snorted with derision. Water pipe would be the least of his problems. That church has been sitting empty for so long, there's no telling what kind of structural damage he might cause. City should never have let him buy it in the first place. Marcus ignored the crowd as he unloaded his equipment and carried it into the church. Duke stayed close by his side, his excitement palpable as they descended the stairs to the basement. The dog immediately went to the spot he had identified the previous day, sitting beside the concrete patch and looking expectantly at Marcus. "All right, boy, let's see what you've found," Marcus said, pulling on safety goggles and work gloves. The jackhammer was heavier than he had expected, and it took several minutes to familiarize himself with its operation. When he finally fired it up, the noise was deafening in the confined space of the basement, echoing off the concrete walls like thunder in a canyon. Duke retreated to the far end of the basement, covering his sensitive ears with his paws, but never taking his eyes off the excavation site. Marcus worked slowly and carefully, breaking through the concrete patch bit by bit and trying not to damage whatever might be hidden beneath. The concrete was thicker than he had anticipated, nearly 8 inches deep, and it had been reinforced with steel mesh that made the job even more difficult. After an hour of steady work, Marcus's jackhammer finally broke through the last layer of concrete and hit something that wasn't stone or earth. The sound was different, more hollow, like metal striking wood. Marcus shut off the jackhammer and knelt beside the hole he had created, using a flashlight to peer into the depths below. What he saw made his hands shake with excitement. Beneath the concrete, perfectly preserved in the dry basement air, was a wooden crate about the size of a coffin. The wood was dark with age, but appeared to be in excellent condition, and Marcus could make out metal hinges and a heavy lock that had somehow survived decades of burial. Stenciled letters on the side of the crate were barely visible, but Marcus could make out what appeared to be a date, 1943. Duke had crept closer as Marcus worked, and now he was standing at the edge of the excavated hole, his tail wagging with the kind of excitement Marcus hadn't seen since their days in Afghanistan, when they had uncovered important intelligence caches. Whatever was in that crate, Duke's sensitive nose had detected it through 8 inches of concrete and decades of concealment. The crowd outside had grown during Marcus's excavation, drawn by the sound of the jackhammer and the promise of either spectacular success or equally spectacular failure. When Marcus emerged from the church to get additional tools, he was greeted by nearly 50 townspeople who had gathered to witness his latest act of perceived foolishness. "Well," Harold Peterson called out, his voice carrying clearly across the churchyard, "find Jimmy Hoffa down there, or just a bunch of broken pipes?" Marcus ignored the question and the laughter that followed it. He had learned long ago that the best response to skepticism was results, not words. He loaded his pickup truck with chains, pulleys, and every tool he might need to extract the mysterious crate from its underground hiding place. The work would be difficult and potentially dangerous, but Marcus had handled far more challenging excavations during his military service. Back in the basement, Marcus rigged a pulley system to lift the heavy crate from its concrete tomb. Duke watched every move with intense interest, occasionally offering soft encouragement in the form of gentle whines and tail wags. The crate was heavier than Marcus had expected, probably weighing close to 200 pounds, and it took all of his strength and engineering skills to extract it safely from the hole. When the crate finally rested on the basement floor, Marcus sat back on his heels and studied it more carefully. The wood was some kind of hard wood, possibly oak, and it had been built to last. The metal fittings were brass, green with age but still solid and functional. Most intriguingly, there was a brass nameplate attached to the lid, engraved with words that were almost illegible after decades of tarnish and corrosion. Marcus used a soft brush and some metal polish he had brought from home to carefully clean the nameplate. As the tarnish came away, letters began to emerge. Property of St. Mary's Episcopal Church, Cedar Falls, Iowa. Sealed by order of Father Michael O'Brien, 1943. Duke had been pacing around the crate, his nose working constantly as he investigated every inch of the mysterious container. Whatever was inside had a scent that clearly fascinated the dog, but it wasn't the kind of urgent, dangerous alertness that Duke had shown when detecting explosives in Afghanistan. This was different, more like the excitement of a treasure hunter who knows he's on the verge of a significant discovery. The lock on the crate was massive and old-fashioned, the kind that would have required a heavy iron key. Marcus examined it carefully, looking for some way to open it without destroying the contents of the crate. The lock appeared to be functional despite its age, but Marcus had no idea where to find a key that had been hidden for nearly 80 years. As he pondered this problem, Duke suddenly became very excited, barking and pawing at a corner of the basement that Marcus hadn't thoroughly explored. The dog's behavior was so insistent that Marcus decided to investigate, bringing his flashlight to illuminate the dim corner where several pieces of old church furniture had been stored. Behind a stack of hymnals and beneath a moth-eaten altar cloth, Marcus found a small wooden box that had been hidden so well it might never have been discovered without Duke's extraordinary nose. The box was much smaller than the crate, about the size of a shoebox, and it bore the same brass nameplate and date as the larger container. Inside the smaller box, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from moisture and decay, Marcus found a collection of items that made his heart race with anticipation. There was a brass key that looked like it might fit the crate's lock, along with a leather-bound journal, several yellowed photographs, and a letter sealed with red wax. The journal was filled with entries written in careful handwriting, documenting what appeared to be the final days of St. Mary's operation during World War II. As Marcus read the first few pages, a remarkable story began to emerge. Father Michael O'Brien, the church's pastor during the war years, had been approached by members of the local community who were engaged in activities that went far beyond normal wartime support efforts. According to the journal, a group of Cedar Falls residents had been secretly helping Jewish refugees escape Nazi persecution, providing them with temporary shelter and assistance in reaching safety in Canada or other secure locations. The operation had been small but remarkably effective, saving dozens of lives over the course of several years. But as the war drew to a close and victory seemed assured, the group had faced a terrible dilemma. They had accumulated a significant amount of wealth during their rescue operations, partly from the grateful families they had helped, and partly from the sale of valuables that refugees had entrusted to them for safekeeping. This money was intended to be used for post-war reconstruction and to help Holocaust survivors rebuild their lives. But the group had learned that federal investigators were beginning to ask questions about their activities. Father O'Brien's journal revealed that while their humanitarian work had been motivated by the highest principles, some of their methods had technically violated federal laws regarding currency exchange and immigration assistance. Faced with the possibility of prosecution that could have destroyed the lives of everyone involved, the group had made the difficult decision to hide the money until it was safe to use it for its intended purpose. Marcus read the journal entries with growing amazement, realizing that Duke had led him to what might be one of the most significant historical discoveries in Cedar Falls history. The crate almost certainly contained the money that Father O'Brien and his collaborators had hidden, along with documents that could provide invaluable insight into a little-known chapter of World War II history. But as Marcus prepared to open the crate with the key he had found, he realized that this discovery was far too important to handle alone. The contents of the crate belonged not just to him, but to the community and to history itself. He needed to involve experts who could properly preserve and document whatever treasures lay hidden in the wooden container. Duke seemed to sense Marcus's indecision, whining softly and nudging his master's hand with his nose. The dog had done his job, leading Marcus to a discovery that would change everything they thought they knew about their small Iowa town. Now it was up to Marcus to decide what to do with the knowledge and responsibility that Duke had placed in his hands. As the afternoon shadows lengthened in the basement of St. Mary's Episcopal Church, Marcus sat beside the mysterious crate and considered his options. Outside, he could hear the voices of the townspeople who had gathered to witness his excavation, their skepticism and mockery still evident in every word. They had no idea that their ridicule was about to be transformed into amazement, or that the crazy veteran they had dismissed as a fool was about to give their community a gift beyond their wildest imagination. The weight of discovery pressed down on Marcus like a physical force, reminding him of the moments in Afghanistan when intelligence gathered by his unit had the potential to save lives or change the course of military operations. This felt similar, but different, carrying with it the power to heal old wounds and honor the memory of heroes whose sacrifices had been hidden for nearly 8 decades. Duke settled down beside the crate, his duty fulfilled and his excitement gradually giving way to the patient watchfulness that had made him such an effective partner during their military service. The dog seemed to understand that the real work was just beginning, and that the secrets he had uncovered would require careful handling and wise decisions from the human he trusted above all others. Marcus reached for his phone, knowing that the next call he made would set in motion events that would transform not only his own life, but the entire story of Cedar Falls and its role in one of history's greatest humanitarian crises. The townspeople who had mocked his purchase of St. Mary's Episcopal Church were about to learn that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in the places where no one thinks to look, waiting for the right person and the right moment to bring them into the light. But that incredible revelation would have to wait for tomorrow, because this story is far from over. What Marcus found inside that crate would shock the entire community and prove that Duke's instincts were more valuable than anyone could have imagined. The truth about St. Mary's hidden treasure was about to change everything. And if you think you know where this story is headed, you're in for some incredible surprises. Make sure you're subscribed to our channel because you won't want to miss what happens when Marcus finally opens that mysterious crate and discovers the secrets that Father O'Brien and his brave collaborators hid beneath the altar of their church. The morning sun cast long shadows across the basement floor as Marcus Thompson returned to St. Mary's Episcopal Church, his mind still reeling from the discovery of Father O'Brien's journal. He had spent most of the night reading and rereading the entries, trying to fully comprehend the magnitude of what lay hidden in the wooden crate. Duke sensed his master's excitement and anticipation, staying close as they descended the familiar stairs to the basement where their lives had been forever changed. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the state historian whom Marcus had contacted the previous evening, arrived precisely at 8 o'clock. A woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, Dr. Warren had spent her career documenting Iowa's role in World War II and had immediately understood the significance of Marcus's discovery. She brought with her a team of graduate students, professional photographers, and preservation specialists who could ensure that whatever they found would be properly documented and protected. Mr. Thompson, I have to tell you that what you described in your phone call last night has the potential to rewrite a significant chapter of our local wartime history, Dr. Warren said as she examined the crate and the smaller box containing Father O'Brien's journal. There are rumors and stories about underground networks operating in Iowa during the war, but we've never had concrete evidence of their activities. Duke watched the proceedings with calm interest, no longer agitated by whatever sense had originally drawn his attention to this spot. The dog seemed satisfied that the right people were now involved, and he settled into a comfortable position where he could observe the careful opening of the crate without interfering with the work of the historians and preservation specialists. Marcus had decided to invite key members of the Cedar Falls community to witness the opening of the crate, partly to share the discovery with the people who would be most affected by its revelations, and partly to transform their skepticism into understanding. Harold Peterson was there, looking skeptical but curious, along with Martha Stevenson, Sarah Mitchell, and Mayor Robert Chen, who had driven over from the city offices as soon as he received Marcus's call. "Before we open this crate, Dr. Warren announced to the assembled group, I want everyone to understand that we are potentially about to witness the unveiling of one of Iowa's most significant historical artifacts. Based on Father O'Brien's journal and the circumstances of its concealment, this container may hold items that document extraordinary acts of courage and humanitarian assistance during World War II. The brass key that Marcus had found in the smaller box fit perfectly into the crate's antique lock. The mechanism turned smoothly despite its age, and the lid opened with a soft creak that seemed to release decades of held secrets into the basement air. What lay inside exceeded everyone's expectations and confirmed the most optimistic interpretations of Father O'Brien's cryptic journal entries. The crate was divided into several compartments, each carefully lined with oiled cloth and designed to protect its contents from moisture and deterioration. The largest compartment contained bundles of currency, both American dollars and various European denominations, wrapped in waterproof materials and accompanied by detailed ledgers documenting their sources and intended uses. Dr. Warren's preliminary count suggested that the money, adjusted for inflation, would be worth several $100,000 in today's currency. But the money, significant as it was, proved to be only part of the treasure. Another compartment contained dozens of photographs documenting the faces and stories of the refugees who had passed through Cedar Falls during the war years. Men, women, and children who had fled Nazi persecution looked out from the carefully preserved images, their eyes reflecting both the trauma of their experiences and the hope that had driven them to seek safety in America. Perhaps most remarkably, the crate contained a collection of personal items that refugees had entrusted to Father O'Brien and his network, intending to reclaim them once they reached permanent safety. There were pieces of jewelry, family photographs, religious artifacts, and documents that represented the only remaining connections these displaced people had to their former lives. Each item was carefully catalogued and accompanied by notes indicating the name and intended destination of its owner. Duke had approached the open crate as Dr. Warren and her team began their careful inventory of its contents. The dog's behavior was gentle and respectful, as if he understood the sacred nature of what they had uncovered. He sniffed carefully at each item as it was removed from the crate, his sensitive nose reading stories that no human could detect. "This is absolutely extraordinary," Dr. Warren said, her voice filled with professional excitement and personal awe. "This collection represents not just a significant financial treasure, but a priceless historical archive that documents the courage and compassion of ordinary Americans during one of history's darkest periods." Marcus watched the careful excavation of the crate's contents with growing understanding of the responsibility that Duke's discovery had placed upon him. This wasn't just about money or even historical significance. These items represented the hopes and dreams of people who had entrusted their most precious possessions to strangers, believing that someday they would be reunited with the remnants of their former lives. Mayor Chen, a practical man who had initially been skeptical of Marcus's purchase of the church, now stood in stunned silence as Dr. Warren's team documented item after item of historical significance. "Mr. Thompson, I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I was among those who questioned your judgment in buying this building. It's clear now that you were guided by instincts that the rest of us couldn't understand." Harold Peterson, who had been the most vocal critic of Marcus's purchase, was examining one of the refugee photographs with particular interest. "This man," he said, pointing to a distinguished-looking gentleman with kind eyes and a carefully trimmed beard, "looks familiar. I think this might be Abraham Goldstein, the man who opened the jewelry store on Main Street in 1947. He always said he came here from somewhere in Europe, but he never talked about his past." Dr. Warren looked up from her documentation with excitement. "If we can establish connections between the people in these photographs and individuals who later became permanent residents of Cedar Falls, we'll have documented one of the most successful refugee assistance operations in Iowa's history. This could be the missing piece of a puzzle that historians have been trying to solve for decades." As the inventory continued, more connections began to emerge between the contents of the crate and the subsequent history of Cedar Falls. Several of the names in Father O'Brien's ledgers corresponded to families who had established businesses or made significant contributions to the community in the decades following the war. What had been hidden as potentially incriminating evidence of illegal activity was now revealed as documentation of extraordinary humanitarian success. Duke's role in the discovery had not gone unnoticed by the assembled group. Dr. Warren, in particular, was fascinated by the dog's ability to detect the crate's presence through 8 inches of concrete and decades of concealment. "Animals have senses that we're only beginning to understand," she explained to Marcus. It's entirely possible that Duke detected chemical signatures or even trace odors from the crate's contents that no human nose could perceive. The basement of St. Mary's Episcopal Church had been transformed from a dusty storage area into something resembling an archaeological dig site, with Dr. Warren's team carefully cataloguing and preserving each item they removed from the crate. Professional lighting had been set up to ensure that the documentation process would meet museum standards, and every photograph and measurement was being recorded for future research and display. But perhaps the most moving discovery came near the bottom of the crate, in a compartment that had been sealed separately from the rest of the contents. Inside, Marcus and Dr. Warren found a collection of letters written by refugees to Father O'Brien and his collaborators, expressing gratitude for the assistance they had received and providing updates on their progress toward permanent safety. One letter, written in careful English by a woman named Rebecca Stern, brought tears to Martha Stevenson's eyes as Dr. Warren read it aloud. "Dear Father O'Brien, I write to tell you that my family has reached safety in Toronto, and we are beginning to build a new life in Canada. The money and documents you kept safe for us made it possible for us to start over, and we will never forget the kindness you showed us during the darkest period of our lives. Someday, when the world is safe again, I hope to return to Cedar Falls to thank you in person and to reclaim the photograph of my parents that I left in your care. Until then, please know that you and your brave friends are in our prayers every day." Marcus realized, as he listened to Rebecca Stern's letter, that Duke had given him something far more valuable than treasure or historical significance. The dog had led him to a story of courage, compassion, and hope that had been waiting nearly 80 years to be told. The people of Cedar Falls were about to learn that their small town had played a heroic role in one of history's greatest humanitarian crises, and that the church they had allowed to fall into abandonment had once been a beacon of hope for some of the world's most desperate refugees. As the morning progressed, and Dr. Warren's team continued their meticulous documentation of the crate's contents, word of the discovery began to spread throughout Cedar Falls and beyond. Local television stations arrived to document the story, and by afternoon, news crews from Des Moines and Chicago had made the journey to the small Iowa town that was suddenly making national headlines. Duke seemed to enjoy the attention, posing patiently for photographs and accepting praise for his role in the discovery with the dignity of a war hero receiving a medal. The dog's calm confidence in the face of chaos reminded Marcus of their days in Afghanistan, when Duke's ability to remain focused under pressure had made the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But the real significance of the discovery became clear when Dr. Warren found, at the very bottom of the crate, a sealed envelope addressed to whoever finds this treasure. Inside, Father O'Brien had left a final message that transformed the entire meaning of what had been hidden beneath the altar of St. Mary's Episcopal Church. "If you are reading this letter," Father O'Brien had written in his careful handwriting, "then God has chosen you to complete the work that we began in darkness and fear. The money in this crate belongs not to any individual or institution, but to the memory of those who trusted us with their lives and their hopes. Use it to continue the work of healing and reconciliation, to help those who are displaced and forgotten, and to ensure that the lessons we learned in our struggle against hatred and intolerance are never lost. Bu." The letter continued with specific instructions for distributing the money and preserving the historical artifacts, but it was the final paragraph that brought the entire story full circle. "I have faith that the right person will find this treasure. Someone whose heart is open to the needs of others and whose courage has been tested in the service of justice. May God bless you in the work ahead, and may the memory of those we helped find safety inspire you to continue building bridges of hope in a broken world." Marcus looked around the basement at the faces of people who had doubted his judgment and questioned his sanity, realizing that Duke's extraordinary abilities had made him the custodian of one of Cedar Falls' most precious secrets. The dog had somehow sensed not just the physical presence of the hidden crate, but the spiritual significance of what it represented. In leading Marcus to this discovery, Duke had given the entire community a chance to reclaim a heroic chapter of their history that had been lost to time and fear. Dr. Warren estimated that the complete documentation and preservation of the crate's contents would take several weeks, but already she was planning a major exhibition that would tell the story of Cedar Falls' role in wartime refugee assistance. The money that Father O'Brien and his collaborators had hidden would be used, according to his wishes, to establish a foundation dedicated to helping modern refugees and preserving the memory of those who had risked everything to assist displaced people during World War II. As evening approached and the crowd of onlookers began to disperse, Marcus found himself alone in the basement with Duke and the open crate that had changed everything. The dog settled beside his master with a contented sigh, his work complete and his instincts vindicated in the most spectacular way possible. Whatever had drawn Duke to this spot had been worth every moment of skepticism and ridicule that Marcus had endured. "Well, boy," Marcus said, scratching behind Duke's ears, "I guess you showed them all, didn't you? Think Father O'Brien would be proud of what we found?" Duke's response was a gentle wag of his tail and a soft whine that seemed to express satisfaction with a job well done. The dog had spent his entire life serving others, first as a rescue animal learning to trust again after early trauma, then as Marcus's companion during their military service, and finally as the unlikely detective who had uncovered one of Iowa's most remarkable hidden treasures. But this incredible story isn't finished yet, and the revelations that came from Duke's amazing discovery were just the beginning of a transformation that would affect not only Marcus and his four-legged partner, but the entire community of Cedar Falls. When word spread about what had been found beneath the altar of St. Mary's Episcopal Church, people came forward with their own pieces of the puzzle, and the true scope of Father O'Brien's wartime network began to emerge. What happened next would prove that sometimes the greatest treasures are not gold or silver, but the connections we make with others and the legacy we leave for future generations. The weeks following Duke's remarkable discovery transformed Cedar Falls from a quiet Iowa town into a destination for historians, journalists, and descendants of World War II refugees from around the world. The basement of St. Mary's Episcopal Church became a carefully controlled archaeological site, with Dr. Warren's team working methodically to document and preserve every item from Father O'Brien's hidden cache. Marcus had become something of a reluctant celebrity, fielding phone calls from news organizations and historical societies who wanted to learn more about the discovery and the remarkable German shepherd who had made it possible. Duke, for his part, seemed to take the attention in stride, accepting treats and praise from visitors while maintaining the dignified bearing that had always characterized his service to Marcus. But it was the community's response to the revelation of their town's hidden wartime history that truly amazed both Marcus and Dr. Warren. Once word spread about Father O'Brien's refugee assistance network, longtime residents began coming forward with stories, documents, and family memories that had been kept secret for nearly 8 decades. Harold Peterson, who had been among Marcus's harshest critics, surprised everyone by appearing at the church 3 weeks after the crate's opening with a cardboard box filled with papers and photographs that his father had hidden in the family's attic. "Dad never talked much about the war years," Harold explained to Dr. Warren as she examined the documents, "but before he died, he told me there were things in that box that might be important someday. I never understood what he meant until now." The documents from Harold's family collection revealed that his father, Henrik Peterson, had been one of the key members of Father O'Brien's network, using his position as the town's hardware store owner to provide tools, supplies, and communication services for the refugee assistance operation. The papers included coded messages, supply lists, and most remarkably, a detailed map showing safe routes through Iowa that refugees had used to reach the Canadian border. Martha Stevenson from the post office contributed an even more significant piece of the historical puzzle. Her grandmother, it turned out, had worked closely with Father O'Brien to coordinate communications between different resistance cells throughout the Midwest. The post office had served as an unofficial message center, with Martha's grandmother using her position to ensure that critical information reached the right people at the right times. Grandma always said the mail had to go through no matter what, Martha explained to the growing group of researchers who had made St. Mary's their temporary headquarters. I thought she was just talking about ordinary mail service, but now I realize she was talking about something much more important. She was helping save lives. As more families came forward with their pieces of the story, Dr. Warren began to understand that Father O'Brien's network had been far larger and more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. The Cedar Falls operation had been just one node in a complex web of assistance that stretched from the East Coast to the Canadian border, helping hundreds of refugees escape Nazi persecution and find safety in North America. Duke continued to play an important role in the ongoing investigation, using his extraordinary nose to detect hidden compartments and buried artifacts that human researchers might have overlooked. Dr. Warren had become fascinated by the dog's abilities, documenting his contributions to the historical investigation and noting that Duke seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to locate items connected to the wartime refugee network. The most emotional discovery came when Dr. Warren and her team began attempting to track down the descendants of the refugees whose possessions had been preserved in Father O'Brien's crate. Using modern genealogical research methods and international databases, they were able to locate several families whose ancestors had passed through Cedar Falls during the war years. Rebecca Stern, the woman whose letter had moved Martha Stevenson to tears, had indeed made it safely to Toronto, where she had raised 3 children and built a successful life as a seamstress and community volunteer. Her grandson, David Goldstein, still lived in Toronto and was thrilled to learn that his grandmother's photograph of her parents had been preserved in the crate for nearly 80 years. When David arrived in Cedar Falls to reclaim his family's belongings, the emotional impact of the moment overwhelmed everyone present. Standing in the basement where his grandmother's treasures had been hidden, holding the photograph that represented her last connection to her murdered parents, David wept openly as he thanked Marcus and Duke for their incredible discovery. My grandmother never stopped talking about the kind people in Iowa who had helped her escape, David said, his voice thick with emotion. She always said she would return someday to thank them properly, but the war and its aftermath made that impossible. She died believing that her parents' photograph was lost forever. To know that it was kept safe all these years by people who never even knew her name, that's the kind of miracle that restores your faith in humanity. Duke, who had been lying quietly nearby during David's emotional reunion with his family's history, suddenly stood and approached the man with gentle confidence. The dog nuzzled David's hand with the same compassion he had shown to wounded soldiers in Afghanistan, somehow understanding that this stranger needed comfort and support. "This dog," David said, kneeling down to embrace Duke. "This incredible dog gave my family back a piece of our past that we thought was lost forever. How do you thank someone for a gift like that?" Marcus, watching the interaction between Duke and David, realized that his dog had done something far more significant than simply locate a buried treasure. Duke had helped heal wounds that had been festering for nearly 80 years, connecting the past with the present in ways that no one could have anticipated. The dog's extraordinary abilities had served not just as a tool for discovery, but as a bridge between generations and cultures, helping to complete stories that had been left unfinished by the chaos of war. As word of the ongoing discoveries spread, Cedar Falls found itself hosting visitors from around the world. Holocaust survivors and their descendants made pilgrimages to the small Iowa town that had provided sanctuary to their families during humanity's darkest hour. Historians came to document the network that had operated in secret for so many years, adding Cedar Falls to the growing list of American communities that had played crucial roles in wartime refugee assistance. The St. Mary's Episcopal Church, which Marcus had purchased in the face of community skepticism, became the centerpiece of a major historical preservation project. The city council, led by Mayor Chen, voted unanimously to provide funding for the complete restoration of the building, which would serve as both a museum documenting the refugee network and a memorial to the courage of ordinary Americans who had risked everything to help strangers in need. Dr. Warren established a research center in the restored church, using Father O'Brien's treasure as the foundation for a comprehensive study of Midwestern refugee assistance during World War II. Graduate students and international scholars came to Cedar Falls to study the documents and artifacts that Duke had helped uncover, transforming the small Iowa town into an unlikely center for Holocaust and refugee studies. But perhaps the most significant outcome of Duke's discovery was the impact it had on contemporary refugee assistance efforts. Father O'Brien's final letter, with its instruction to use the hidden money to help modern displaced people, inspired the creation of the Cedar Falls Refugee Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing assistance to asylum seekers and immigrants who continued to arrive in America seeking safety and opportunity. Marcus found himself appointed as the Foundation's first director, a role that utilized both his military experience and his newfound understanding of the courage required to help strangers in desperate circumstances. Duke became the Foundation's unofficial mascot, greeting visitors to the St. Mary's Center with the same calm dignity he had shown throughout the incredible journey that began with his mysterious interest in the area around the altar. The money from Father O'Brien's crate, combined with donations from inspired community members and visitors from around the world, provided the Foundation with resources to help dozens of refugee families establish new lives in Iowa and surrounding states. What had begun as Marcus's impulsive purchase of an abandoned church had evolved into a living memorial to the power of compassion and the importance of helping those in need. Duke's role in this transformation was recognized in ways that went far beyond the local community. National veterans organizations honored the German Shepherd for his service both in Afghanistan and in uncovering one of America's most significant hidden historical treasures. Dog training organizations studied Duke's remarkable abilities, hoping to understand how his sensitive nose and intuitive intelligence had made such an extraordinary discovery possible. But for Marcus, the most meaningful recognition came from the quiet moments when Duke would rest beside Father O'Brien's restored altar, seeming to understand that his work in this sacred space had helped complete a mission that began during the darkest days of World War II. The dog's presence in the church served as a reminder that healing and hope could emerge from the most unexpected places, guided by instincts and abilities that transcended human understanding. As the first anniversary of Duke's discovery approached, Cedar Falls prepared to host an international conference on refugee assistance and historical preservation, bringing together scholars, survivors, and activists from around the world. The transformation of the community from a place that had mocked Marcus's purchase to a destination that celebrated courage and compassion stood as testament to the power of hidden truths to change hearts and minds. The conference would feature presentations by Dr. Warren and her research team, sharing their findings about the sophisticated network that had operated throughout the Midwest during World War II. But the keynote speaker would be David Goldstein, representing the descendants of refugees who had found safety through the courage of ordinary Americans like Father O'Brien and his collaborators. Duke, now recognized as one of the most famous dogs in Iowa, would receive a special honor for his role in uncovering this remarkable piece of history. But Marcus knew that his faithful companion's greatest satisfaction came not from awards or recognition, but from the knowledge that his extraordinary abilities had served a purpose greater than either of them could have imagined. Standing in the restored St. Mary's Episcopal Church, surrounded by exhibits documenting the courage and compassion of people who had risked everything to help strangers, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him and Duke to this place. What had seemed like an impulsive purchase driven by loneliness and a need for purpose had become the foundation for a legacy that would inspire future generations to remember that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they chose compassion over indifference. The basement where Duke had first detected the hidden crate now housed a permanent exhibit dedicated to the German Shepherd's remarkable abilities and his role in one of Iowa's most significant historical discoveries. Visitors could see photographs and videos documenting the excavation process, along with detailed explanations of how Duke's sensitive nose had detected artifacts buried beneath 8 inches of concrete for nearly 8 decades. But the real treasure of St. Mary's Episcopal Church was not the money or artifacts that Duke had helped uncover. It was the story of courage, hope, and compassion that continued to inspire everyone who visited the small Iowa church, where a war veteran and his extraordinary dog had discovered that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in the places where no one thinks to look, waiting for the right moment and the right hearts to bring them into the light. The golden afternoon sun streamed through the restored stained glass windows of St. Mary's Episcopal Church as Marcus Thompson stood before an audience that would have been unimaginable just 1 year earlier. The sanctuary was filled with Holocaust survivors, historians, government officials, and visitors from dozens of countries who had come to Cedar Falls to participate in the International Conference on Wartime Refugee Assistance. Duke lay beside the altar, wearing a special collar that identified him as an honorary member of the National Search and Rescue Association, his calm presence a reminder of the extraordinary discovery that had transformed this small Iowa community into a center for historical research and refugee advocacy. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, now the director of the St. Mary's Historical Research Center, had spent the past year documenting the full scope of Father O'Brien's refugee network. Her research, made possible by Duke's incredible discovery, had revealed that the Cedar Falls operation was part of a sophisticated underground railroad that had helped more than 800 refugees escape Nazi persecution and find safety in North America. The documentation found in the hidden crate provided the missing pieces of a historical puzzle that scholars had been attempting to solve for decades. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Warren announced to the assembled audience, when Marcus Thompson made the decision to purchase this abandoned church, guided by instincts he couldn't fully explain, he had no idea that his faithful companion Duke would lead us to one of the most significant historical discoveries in Iowa's history. Today we gather not just to celebrate that discovery, but to honor the memory of the brave men and women who risked everything to help strangers in desperate need. The conference had drawn attendees from around the world, but none were more important than the elderly man who sat in the front row, his weathered hands folded over a wooden cane. Rabbi Samuel Klein, at 96 years old, was one of the few surviving refugees who had personally benefited from Father O'Brien's network. He had arrived in Cedar Falls as a frightened 18-year-old fleeing Nazi-occupied Poland, and he had never forgotten the kindness shown to him by the community that had risked their safety to provide him with shelter and assistance. "I remember this church," Rabbi Klein had told Marcus when he arrived for the conference. "I spent 3 nights sleeping in the basement in 1943, waiting for the all-clear signal that would allow me to continue my journey to Canada. Father O'Brien was the kindest man I ever met, and the people of this community treated me like family, even though they knew that helping me could get them in serious trouble with the authorities." Duke had taken an immediate liking to Rabbi Klein, perhaps sensing in the elderly man's gentle demeanor the same compassion that had drawn the dog to investigate the area around the altar. The German shepherd had appointed himself as the rabbi's unofficial guardian during the conference, staying close to his side and offering the kind of comfort that only animals seemed capable of providing to those who had survived unimaginable trauma. Marcus had been reluctant to speak at the conference, feeling that the attention should focus on the historical significance of the discovery rather than his own role in uncovering it. But Dr. Warren had convinced him that his perspective as both a veteran and the person whose faith in Duke had made everything possible was an essential part of the story that needed to be told. "When I bought this church," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the restored sanctuary, "the people of Cedar Falls thought I had lost my mind. Maybe I had, in a way. I was a broken-down veteran looking for something to give my life meaning. And Duke was a rescue dog who had learned to trust again after early trauma. Neither of us knew what we were looking for when we walked through that door, but somehow we found exactly what this community needed." The audience listened in respectful silence as Marcus described the months of restoration work that had preceded Duke's remarkable discovery. He spoke of the dog's unusual behavior around the altar, the decision to investigate despite community skepticism, and the moment when the jackhammer had broken through the concrete to reveal Father O'Brien's hidden treasure. "But the real treasure wasn't the money or the artifacts," Marcus continued, his eyes finding Duke's steady gaze. "It was the story that those items told. The revelation that our small town had played a heroic role in one of history's greatest humanitarian crises. Duke didn't just find a buried crate. He helped us discover that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, are capable of remarkable courage and compassion." Rabbi Klein had requested permission to address the conference, and when he took the podium, his presence commanded the respectful attention of everyone in the sanctuary. Despite his advanced age, his voice was strong and clear, as he shared memories that had been locked away for nearly 8 decades. "The young people today cannot imagine what it was like to be hunted simply for being Jewish," Rabbi Klein said, his eyes moving across the faces in the audience. "We were desperate, frightened, and far from home, with no guarantee that anyone would help us. But in places like Cedar Falls, in churches like this one, we found Americans who were willing to risk everything to give strangers a chance at life." He paused, looking down at Duke, who was watching him with the intense attention that the dog reserved for those he sensed were important. "This remarkable dog has given us back a piece of history that we thought was lost forever. But more than that, he has reminded us that acts of courage and kindness echo through generations, inspiring new acts of compassion that can heal wounds we didn't even know existed." Noise. The highlight of the conference came when David Goldstein, Rebecca Stern's grandson, presented Duke with a special recognition from the Canadian Jewish Congress for his role in recovering artifacts that had preserved the memory of Holocaust victims and survivors. The ceremony was emotional for everyone present, but particularly meaningful for Marcus, who had watched his faithful companion evolve from a traumatized rescue dog into a national hero whose abilities had changed the course of historical understanding. Duke accepted the honor with his characteristic dignity, sitting perfectly still as David placed a medal around his neck. The inscription read, "In recognition of extraordinary service in preserving the memory of those who suffered persecution and honoring the courage of those who provided assistance during humanity's darkest hour. But perhaps the most significant moment of the conference came when Dr. Warren announced the establishment of the Duke and Marcus Thompson Endowment for Refugee Assistance, funded by donations from conference attendees and inspired by Father O'Brien's final letter requesting that his hidden treasure be used to continue helping displaced people. The endowment would provide permanent funding for the Cedar Falls Refugee Foundation, ensuring that the work begun by Father O'Brien's network would continue indefinitely. The announcement brought Marcus to tears as he realized that Duke's discovery had created something far greater than either of them could have imagined. What had begun as a lonely veteran's impulsive purchase of an abandoned church had evolved into an international movement dedicated to helping refugees and preserving the memory of those who had shown extraordinary courage during World War II. As the conference concluded and visitors began to depart, Marcus found himself alone in the sanctuary with Duke and Rabbi Klein. The elderly man had asked to spend a few quiet moments in the church where he had found safety so many years ago, and Marcus was honored to provide him with that opportunity. "This dog of yours," Rabbi Klein said, reaching down to stroke Duke's head with gentle hands. "He has accomplished something that no human could have achieved. He has helped heal wounds that have been bleeding for 80 years, and he has shown us that memory and compassion are forces more powerful than hatred and fear." Duke leaned into the rabbi's touch, his tail wagging slowly as if he understood the significance of the moment. The dog had spent his entire life serving others, first learning to trust after early trauma, then supporting Marcus through the challenges of post-war adjustment, and finally using his extraordinary abilities to uncover one of history's most remarkable hidden treasures. Marcus looked around the restored sanctuary, taking in the exhibits that documented Father O'Brien's network, the photographs of refugees who had found safety through the courage of ordinary Americans, and the memorial wall that honored the memory of those who had perished in the Holocaust. The transformation of St. Mary's from an abandoned building into a living memorial was complete, but Marcus knew that the real work was just beginning. The Cedar Falls Refugee Foundation had already begun assisting modern refugee families, providing them with the same kind of support that Father O'Brien's network had offered to displaced people during World War II. The foundation's offices, housed in the renovated church basement where Duke had made his incredible discovery, served as headquarters for a new generation of Americans committed to helping strangers in need. Duke's role in the Foundation's work went far beyond his status as the dog who had uncovered the hidden treasure. His presence in the church provided comfort to refugee families who were struggling to adapt to life in America, and his calm demeanor helped children overcome the trauma and fear that often accompanied displacement and cultural adjustment. Dr. Warren had documented dozens of instances where Duke seemed to sense which visitors needed extra attention and support, approaching them with the same intuitive understanding he had shown to wounded soldiers in Afghanistan. The dog's ability to provide emotional support transcended language barriers and cultural differences, making him an invaluable part of the Foundation's work with refugee communities. As evening approached and Rabbi Klein prepared to return to his hotel, he offered Marcus and Duke a blessing that seemed to capture the spiritual significance of everything they had accomplished. "May the God who watched over Father O'Brien and his brave collaborators continue to guide your work in helping those who have nowhere else to turn. May the memory of those we have honored inspire future generations to choose compassion over indifference, and may this remarkable dog continue to serve as a reminder that extraordinary gifts come in forms we least expect." Marcus walked Duke through the church grounds as darkness settled over Cedar Falls, reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought them to this point. The dog moved with the confidence of an animal who knew he was exactly where he belonged, stopping occasionally to investigate scents that only his sensitive nose could detect, but always returning to Marcus's side with the loyalty that had characterized their partnership from the beginning. The lights of the restored St. Mary's Episcopal Church cast a warm glow across the cemetery where Father O'Brien and many of his collaborators were buried, their headstones now marked with plaques identifying their roles in the wartime refugee network. The church that had once been abandoned and forgotten had become a beacon of hope and remembrance, attracting visitors from around the world who came to learn about courage, compassion, and the power of ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. Duke's discovery had proven that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right person with the right heart to bring them into the light. The German shepherd had used his extraordinary abilities not just to locate a buried crate, but to help an entire community rediscover its capacity for heroism and compassion. As they returned to the church for one final check before going home, Marcus paused at the altar where Duke had first detected the scents that led to their incredible discovery. The dog sat beside him, both of them comfortable in the silence that filled the sanctuary like a blessing. They had found what they were looking for without even knowing they were searching for it, and in the process, they had given the world a gift that would continue inspiring acts of courage and kindness for generations to come. The story of Marcus Thompson and his remarkable German shepherd Duke had become a testament to the power of faith, the importance of listening to our instincts, and the truth that sometimes the most significant discoveries come from the most unexpected sources. In a world that often seemed divided by fear and suspicion, their story offered proof that compassion and understanding could bridge any gap, heal any wound, and transform any community willing to embrace the possibility that ordinary people, guided by extraordinary love, could accomplish miracles that would echo through eternity. And if you've been moved by this incredible story of faith, perseverance, and the amazing bond between a veteran and his loyal companion, then you know why it's so important to share these tales of hope and courage with others. The story of Marcus and Duke reminds us that sometimes the most valuable treasures aren't gold or silver, but the connections we make with others and the legacy of compassion we leave behind. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss the amazing tales of courage and hope that prove the human spirit can overcome any challenge. Share this story with your friends and family, because in a world that often focuses on division and conflict, we all need reminders that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they choose love over fear and compassion over indifference.